At the beginning of the year, before I read Stormlight Archive, and that became my favorite series of all time, my most anticipated book this year was To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini, which you may recognize that name because he's the author of the Inheritance Cycle, the Aragon books that you remember from way back in the day. They were really fun when you were a kid. The Aragon series was really important to me growing up, and I think that's a pretty common experience for people that were kids around the same time that I was, and maybe even others. It's been a very long time since Christopher Paolini released a new thing outside of that series. He just released like a short story collection for that series recently. But when he announced that he was writing a sci-fi novel called To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, I was beyond hype. I wanted to see what was going to happen with this author that I loved so much when I was a child. Listening to a lot of the To Sleep in a Sea of Stars pre-release coverage, I was amped and ready to go. The cover was dropped and it looked awesome, and To Sleep in a Sea of Stars was something that I was so excited to do. I started a public buddy read on my Discord server. The link for that server is down below, by the way. It is unfortunate news that I have to bring to you today, which is the fact that I was not a fan of this book. I'm not trying to just make a rant review. I'm going to try to make this as useful as possible, but I will get it out of the gate right away. This book was so very disappointing to me because I wanted so badly to love it. Before I get started, let me talk about a brief summary. To Sleep in a Sea of Stars takes place in a world where we are already up in space, like humans have been in space for a while. We're looking around and doing different, financially gaining opportunities in space. What if somebody comes across an alien and crap starts happening? That's pretty much all I'll say. Before I jump into specifics, I want to try to get this out of the way in case you see this as a bias, but this may be useful to a certain type of person. Growing up and reading the Aragon books, something that I would always tell my friend without being able to quantify it was, I absolutely love this story and I love experiencing it, but I really don't like reading it. And I think that is just a personal taste that I have against the way that Christopher Paolini writes. Now, this is an adult book versus a young adult book, but it maintained true. Even while I was interested in elements of the story, actually reading the story was a real struggle for me. I don't think I just vibe well with the way Paolini writes, and I can't put particular words to exactly what does it. He has a very straightforward writing style similar to someone like Brandon Sanderson, and a lot of the things I may criticize in this video may be things that people also complain about with Brandon Sanderson, but where Brandon Sanderson is able to make me actively love reading those books and sort of see the prose as transparent, I almost always find myself getting annoyed by Paolini's prose without even always being able to put a pin on exactly what it is. But the main thing I have to mention is almost 0% of the times that Christopher Paolini tries to make humor in his books, or tries to make something like comic relief, or tries to do something a little bit cute, I actively despise it most of the time. This was true in the Aragon series, but you could chalk it up to it being young adult and him being a younger writer. It continues on here. There's a lot of times where characters try to make jokes and there's banter and there's a little bit of silly elements thrown in to try to relieve some of the crazy pressure of this story, and I just can't vibe with almost any of them. I don't mean this to be like a personal jab against Christopher Paolini. I love to listen to him talk in these interviews, but I really can't stand when he tries to make you chuckle in the text. And it isn't just a case of a character using a bad joke. It's like this actively brings me out of the story because of how much I don't vibe with what you're trying to say. This kind of goes for any time he names something in the series. And I understand it sounds like I'm nitpicking, but when you write a sci-fi novel about, aliens and this entire new level of technology that we have, and you are naming lots of new things in your story, it comes up a lot when every single time you name something, I can't even with it. The names of the aliens, the names of the ships, the names of some of the characters and their nicknames, the names of powers, none of it works for me. And that is a huge part of the story when you may not think it is, but that may not bother everybody, so let's move on. As someone who reads almost exclusively tomes at this point, meaning like books that are 500 pages or more, I wasn't really intimidated by the size of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars because I read lots of large books and I love lots of large books. But something I will say about large books that I tend to like is I feel like I want to spend time in that world. I feel like I'm getting to know the characters. I feel like I'm having the plot suck me in. This book, it did not justify its page count. This part is probably going to make me sound not credible as a book reviewer, but I'm going to share my experience with you, and I want you to take it for what it's worth. I was given access to this book early in audiobook form, since I have read and switched back and forth between the ebook and the audiobook a lot. But when I was listening to it in audiobook form, I had a heck of a time paying attention to the story. This is not like an audiobook specific thing. This is a this book specific thing because nothing about the prose was gripping me. Lots of things were like turning me away. And in addition to this, and I'm going to admit this, there were multiple times when I was listening to this audiobook and I fell asleep because I was tired. Like, I'm not going to put it all in the book. I'm a dad. I have this theme song thing at the end of my videos where I talk about not sleeping enough. That's on me. But I was falling asleep in this book multiple times, sometimes for 5, 10, 15 minutes at a time. I would wake up and like feel like I didn't miss much. Like I'd be listening and be like, okay, I feel like I know exactly what's going on even though I was just sleeping. I would rewind it, re-listen to the same 5, 10, 15 minutes and realize nothing happened. Obviously, there are sections of the book that I don't think you could do that for, but I had it happen multiple times. In the early setup of this book, talking the first 30% of this book, I've had this happen multiple times. Go back, realize I missed nothing. And part of that is due to the fact that a lot of these side characters are just carbon copy tropes from video games or TV or movies. No, the plot is not wholesale ripped off the way that a lot of people like to say that the Aragon books were, which I don't fully agree with that criticism. I actually did enjoy that plot. I haven't read it as an adult, so maybe that could change. No single aspect of any of the parts of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars are complete ripoffs of anything that I'm aware of, but every single element is combined in a way where you've seen every part of this before. That's true for a lot of stories that I enjoy, including most notably recently Malice by John Gwynne. I talked about how this was just a remix of all the things that I've seen before. The difference was I loved it in that book. I didn't hate it in this book. I just didn't care. I was mostly apathetic for large portions of this book. Even when I did want to know what happened to the characters and the story, actively engaging in it was a turnoff. I don't want to say it put me in a reading slump, because it didn't. But also, I could have finished this book so much faster, but my drive to read it was so low because I felt like it was just extremely mediocre in so many ways. I also want to talk about whether this book is plot-driven or character-driven, and the answer is both and neither. The pacing of this book is set up like a science fiction video game. The comparison I'm going to make, if you're familiar with it, is Mass Effect. Basically, you have a setup, rising action. It is extremely obvious when you're about to have action. The action is extremely fast-paced. There are a lot of consequences for a lot of the action scenes, and then it cuts to ship. And ship, you will then talk to one of the crew members, get their backstory, engage, action. Come back to the ship, learn somebody's backstory and talk to them, go to the action. Lots of these characters feel like they're super familiar. I'm not going to say that I didn't grow attached to any of them, because I really did. There was a couple of them that I ended up liking, and there were a couple of moments that I did feel were heartfelt. Unfortunately, those were few and far between, and you just have to meet each of these crew members. Some of them have backstory drops that are supposed to be reveals, but they were kind of predictable and very, very much like, oh, okay. But because it was broken up like this, you don't really spend a lot of time with one character. You're going between a different character each time you do these things. So you get like a decent character summary for each of the characters, and you never actually get to dive into any single one of them that deep. You spend all of your time with the main character, Kira, but I have yet to find a reader that enjoys actually finding out anything about Kira. She's a bland and uninteresting character. And I don't feel like that was an intentional thing where it's like, oh, you're supposed to not like this character. No, I think you're supposed to like her, but it just doesn't work. This is anecdotal. Obviously, there are lots of people that love this book. Notably, one of the bigger reviewers on BookTube, Daniel Green, gave this book a pretty decent rating. But in my buddy read circles, everyone is extremely turned off from this book from jump, due to all these things I've said and more. Now, as I've mentioned, I really struggled to get through this book, but I finally finished this book, and I will admit, around the 60-65% mark, I hit a couple characters that I was interested in. I hit a couple new world elements that I thought were clicking, and I was like, okay, cool, I'm gonna ride this out the rest of the way. And I started getting invested in the rising action, and I started following everything really well. I was like, oh, I may end up liking this book a lot more than I thought after all. I feel bad for some of the negative stuff I was saying in the buddy read early on. But the resolution of this story just completely flopped for me. I've seen a couple different reviews, including one from Reads with Casera, who talked about how the ending of this book may be controversial, like the actual ending of this book may be controversial. Probably, and for me, it didn't work. I actively disliked every choice made for the resolution, and the fall of action section was just confusing why those choices were made. For those of you that aren't familiar, Paolini is trying to set this up as a shared universe between all of his books, and so a lot of the stuff at the end is sort of a setup for, well, if I wanted to write more books in this universe, what would that look like? It just felt very odd and out of place in this story, I thought, and the sourness of the actual conclusion of the story made me care less about what might be in this universe in the future. And I hate to say that. I feel bad criticizing this book because I wanted to like it so bad. I hyped this book really so much. But I'm not going to lie to you and pretend that I liked it more than I did, when the more I think about that ending, the more I'm like, what the crap are we doing? What is this? Now, there is another sort of way that you could interpret this book and the ending of this book specifically. I think that there are some interesting themes and greater ideas brought up. If this was a classic sci-fi novel, you'd spend less time with the characters like you do, and you could take away the actual underlying current themes of what's going on and try to use it for that purpose. The problem with that is I do think you could come up with a short story that tried to come up with some of the same ideals that Paolini, I think, pushed with the ending in this book. Unfortunately, the more I thought about that aspect, the more I realized that part of the story could have easily been written into a fairly short novella or short story and had pretty much the same impact as far as I can understand, especially because you never fully are invested. I was never fully invested in the plot or the characters the way that I was supposed to be for a book that's almost 900 pages. If you wanted to take the themes that you had, you could have just put them in a short story and it would have worked better and you wouldn't have wasted as much time. Or you could have made it longer and spent more time with character development, maybe spent more time fleshing out the interesting parts of the world instead of just constantly trying to drive this plot forward and then stopping when you wanted to tell us about one of your characters. The book did not justify the length that it was, and you don't hear me say that often. Now, I don't want to crap on this the whole time, right? I've said my negative pieces. I don't want to go into full-on rant review territory. What were some things I did enjoy about the book? Well, I did want to know what was going to happen with the story overall. I still think Paolini came up with a fairly interesting narrative with the exception of the way that he chose to end it. I did want to know what was going to happen. Though honestly, if I hadn't been hyping up the buddy read and if this wasn't such a big book, I might have DNF'd it. Crap, I don't want to get to the negative. What's more positive? I think there are some awesome world building elements that Christopher Paolini had in this book. While I was soured by the ending, I do think the potential setup for where this could go in the future could be interesting. Some of the history in this world and some of the ideals of things that have changed for humanity from where we are today to where the book takes place. Some of the stuff is super awesome. One of the things that I loved that Paolini did do in this book was there is a ton of awesome technology that it makes sense that it would become a standard dependency for humanity that he doesn't have to feel the need to explain. He talks about it in the story. He never explains it. Characters use it and it's that is stupid useful. That's a tech we could definitely have in the future. We could almost have it now. And of course it would be something that everyone comes to rely upon, and if it was taken away, it'd be a big deal. Lots and lots and lots of quality of life stuff they have in the future that he doesn't feel the need to give a ton of backstory with. He's like, hey, the characters have this, you can figure out how that would be useful. Love that stuff. That was some awesome science fiction postulating. Additionally, one of the things that I enjoyed about this story that did keep me going at different points of the narrative was I love a mysterious world, especially when you're going out in the stars, in space, and there's so much you don't know. I like the mystery of things. I like when characters are in the dark and they have to figure things out as they go, and I like when that stuff is like mystical feeling. And Paolini pulled that off to different degrees at multiple times throughout this book, even if the payoff didn't necessarily work for me. Okay, I think that is my non-extraneous, non-hyperbolic thoughts out of the way. Would I be interested in seeing something else that Christopher Paolini wrote? Yes, I think I would give him another shot. I think if I felt the same way about his next adult book that I did after this book, and I got 2 books that were like this for me, I'd probably be done for a significant amount of time. Do I think this book is awful? No, but for me, it's definitely a 2-star read. It was 3 stars most of the way through at varying points. It almost made it to 4 stars when I started getting invested in the story, but the way it concluded dropped it down to 2 for me. I just can't vibe with it, and I can't talk about it without being specific. People that have finished may be making assumptions about me that are not true. I don't know how to talk about that without getting spoilery. If you want to talk to me about To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, you want to ask me questions or whatever, and you don't mind long-form discussion or hearing spoilers or whatever, please join my Discord down below, because I'd love to talk specifically about the things that I don't like about this book in spoiler form, and I could be way more articulate and detailed. Hopefully some of this made sense anyway. Of course, after I make a video of trying to defend why I have so many positive reviews, I get a stinker that I don't really like. I hope this video made sense to you. If you like this video, please leave a thumbs up. If you want to see more videos from me in the future, you can hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, you'll get notifications when I post a new video. As I've mentioned before, there's a Discord channel you can follow, link down below. Also, if you'd like to support this channel financially, help me out a little bit, there is a link down below to like some dumb merch that I made, and also a Patreon that you can follow. Hopefully there's some added goodies there if you're into that sort of thing. Have you read this book? Please leave your thoughts down below. Are you excited to read it? Did my review change your mind at all? Is this disappointing news for you? Are you a fan of Inheritance? Did you not like Inheritance and you didn't have high hopes for here? I want to hear all your thoughts down below, please. Regardless of how this book made you feel or this review made you feel, I hope that you're having an awesome week, and I hope to see you again in the future. Thank you guys for watching.
No one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep. No one ever get enough. If it don't show up, I might get fired. Sleep. No one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep. No one ever get enough. If it don't show up, I might